Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Conservation Lunch and Learn webinar series. Thank you, Sonia, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with us about the Pay for Performance program. And for those who are new, or as a reminder, for folks who've been here before, let's see if I can progress. There we go. Our Vermont Ag Water Quality Partnership. We work collectively with the, let's see if I can run down all of the partners as a reminder, the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Farm Service Agency, UVM Extension, Lake Champlain Basin Program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation, the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, and the Natural Resource Conservation Districts, and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And collaboratively, we have a vision that Vermont will be populated by farms that are vibrant, robust, and sustainable, and that they steward their land for water quality as well as wildlife habitat for the benefit of farms, connected ecosystems, the public, and general good of Vermont. And our purpose and mission is that we will improve ag water quality in Vermont by coordinating all partner efforts to provide education, technical and financial assistance to the farming communities. And we have three overarching goals in which we want to achieve that. We want to improve water quality and wildlife habitat on all engaged farmland owners or operators' properties. We want to deliver technical and financial assistance in an efficient and effective way, and also have that be the best service experience possible for the landowner. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sonia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. So, sharing my screen. Hi, everyone. Allie, can you give me a thumbs up if my screen sharing looks good? Great, thank you. So I'm Sonia Howlett. I work at the Agency of Agriculture in the Water Quality Division. I've been involved for the last couple of years with the Vermont Pay for Performance program, VAWQP, here to update a little about how it's going and remind folks who might not have heard some of our rollout earlier a couple of years back of kind of how we got here and where we are now. Before I do any of that, though, I did want to introduce something, our very most exciting news from the program, which is that as of 3 weeks ago, we have a new program coordinator replacing Brody. Sumner, I don't know if you want to turn your camera on and introduce yourself quickly before we get started. That would be great.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Sumner LeBaron Bryan, and like Sonia said, I've only been here for about 2.5 weeks. I come from Vermont Community Loan Fund, where I was a business advisor for a lot of small businesses and entrepreneurs across the state of Vermont, focusing my work in agriculture. So super happy to be here, and I'm going to attempt to take as much work off of Sonia's plate as possible as I continue to onboard. But yeah, thank you, and I can't wait to meet you all and get to know you better.
So if we have another one of these next year, it'll probably be Sumner taking the lead on sharing that information. But we have a really great team working on this project. So I think I saw Nina on the call. Jensen Peck's also been helping a lot with this program, and you can learn more on the website once I'm through, or reach out to any of us. But without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about what got us here, how the program's set up, which has changed a little bit from how it was rolled out. I was hoping to have 2022 and 2023 calendar year results to share with you all. As of right now, only the 2022 ones are ready to share, but Judson did a little bit of diving into the analysis of kind of, what we're seeing on the landscape in terms of the model we're using. Talk a little bit about what's coming next, what our takeaways have been, and then I do want to talk a little bit about another performance-based program in the state, which is CSP, and kind of how the state's been supporting that as well, briefly at the end. We will have time for questions. I will try to stop throughout, and then we can have more discussion at the end. If you have any pressing clarifications, feel free to drop them in the chat. Ellie said she would monitor that and stop me if needed. Otherwise, hold on. Write down your questions somewhere and hold on to them, and I hope to have time to answer them. So To back up a little bit, this is not new to any of us in the Water Quality Partnership, but water quality has been a focus and a concern in the state for a while, with total maximum daily loads in Lake Champlain and other basins across the state. We similarly are weighing, changing climates in the state, knowing that both as we adapt to the effects of that, we're also having to change our practices potentially to reduce carbon emissions. And all of this is leading to, a challenging landscape for farms, right? So we've got the total maximum daily load reductions, which are, I don't know if ambitious is the right word, but there's a lot of work to be done. And then at the same time, as we all are aware, the farm viability, especially of dairy farms, is a challenging situation right now. These are conversations that we've been having for a long time. One of the conversations that started happening in the last couple of years is like, okay, yes, those are challenges, but can there be opportunities in that space, right? Can we be more targeted in how we're doing our conservation, really focusing money and efforts on the practices or the farms or the specific watersheds or whatever that's the most going to have the most effect and to get us the furthest towards our TMDL? And then kind of tied with that, can we compensate farms for the environmental benefit they're providing? Is there this like win-win space where we could get there? And a lot of our programs, as you know, are already doing that. But, I think 2019, 2018, there were these conversations around like, let's think about what farms are doing for our landscape. The word the scientists use for that is ecosystem services, and recognize that of all of the benefits that a well-managed farm can provide, what people are really being compensated for right now is for the food that they produce and for any raw materials extracted from their land, right? These other more intangible benefits that we know come from well-managed land but are harder to measure aren't really something that farms have traditionally been compensated for, right? Like soil formation or carbon cycling or climate regulation, all of those things. So the idea that has been happening nationwide and across the world is like, well, maybe we can more intentionally form closed loop systems where we pay the producers of those ecosystem services for those services on behalf of the users in the community. So this example is from an article and is referring specifically to clean water, right? So clean water is coming down from these farms in the hills. It's flowing into the cities. Those cities are benefiting from the management of those upstream communities. And as of right now, they've been getting that for free, right? And so is there a way to close that loop with a project that can pay the creators of it? I think something important to notice here is that example is very specifically pay for performance driven, right? Like, let's look at the outcome for let's look at the clean water. Let's look at, how many gallons of it is flowing into that city. And another lens, right, is the paying for practices, right? What are you doing on your land? How much did it cost you to plant that buffer, to plant that cover crop, whatever you're doing? And can we provide funds towards that implementation? And that's typically, per acre or per foot of fence, per tree, et cetera, rather than per pound of phosphorus, ton of CO2, or so on and so forth. And I think when these conversations started happening, there was this idea of, oh, payment for ecosystem services is new. It's not happening. It should be happening. And we realized since that, no, we are paying for ecosystem services. It's just in Vermont, typically that has always been paying for practices. So, and, EQIP's a really classic example of you do something, we assume that it's going to have a benefit and we pay you for doing it. CSP is a little bit, the conservation stewardship program is a little bit in between them. There's an element of the payments that is really more implementation enhancement based. And then there's another element that's based on like, where is your farm at now, based on our assessment of your current status. But regardless, paying for performance, for outcomes across the board is an underutilized tool in conservation on Vermont farms. So part of that conversation in June of 2019, the legislature created a working group to dive into these questions of how to pay for ecosystem services. What would that look like? This working group was really motivated by farmers at the time, and they were asked to go through a laundry list of things that they were supposed to report back to the legislature, but particularly to kind of identify what the opportunities are and what is happening and what could happen. Many meetings later, they arrived over the course of their first year and a half of discussion at the focus on, okay, soil health is important. If we are going to pay for performance, let's make sure it's quantifiable and we have an outcome that we can measure, that we can choose what to pay on. Make sure farms are compensated adequately. Make sure that any program we develop is farmer-driven, research-based, and inclusive of a wide variety of farming styles in Vermont. So that group was meeting. The Agency of Agriculture was part of the group, was participating in those conversations, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around this new tool, this new idea. The working group was really leaning towards a very holistic decision, but wasn't really focusing or wasn't at a space that was ready to put a program on the ground yet. And then 2020 hit. It was COVID. We had started our COVID project, which was we took the learning from having participated in that working group, and as an agency, we decided, hey, let's just try something. Let's put an application in for NRCS's opportunity that was open that year, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, Alternate Funding Arrangement, AFA. So that's a lot of acronyms, but the idea is that NRCS was putting money out to enable and to uplift partner organizations to develop their own programs that would achieve NRCS's goals of conservation outcomes on farms. We learned that it was a little less flexible than we had hoped originally, but ultimately the split of responsibilities and the collaboration here is that we, as the lead partner, if we were to get a grant, which we did, we develop the guidance and payment rates for the practices that we're interested in. We can provide and administer TA, and we run the program ourselves. So we're the ones issuing payments, selecting farms, developing contracts, et cetera. And then NRCS is supporting us through helping us meet the NRCS requirements, such as highly erodible lands and wetlands compliance. They're also making sure that the program we administer is in line with federal NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act, I believe is what that stands for, compliance. And they kind of review and provide reimbursement payments to us along the way. So we were really grateful for this opportunity and to have this partnership with NRCS to be able to try something brand new in Vermont that we definitely wouldn't have had money for otherwise. So we were one of the first cohort of these type of awards. So the RCPP Classics, which is more like NRCS does the admin, have existed for longer, but we were the first of the alternative funding arrangements alongside some colleague projects across the US. Since then, this map has grown considerably. They've offered this funding to more projects, and that's really, there really are projects across the US these days. But what we got back in 2021 was we got an award that lasted 5 years. We were awarded $7 million, of which 70% or close to $5 million will be paid to producers over that time period. And so far, we've worked with over 70 farmers through this program. When we put this program together, we started to really hone in on wanting to make TMDL reductions through the practices we paid for. Again, really focusing in on the quantification and making sure that the outcomes were verifiable. making sure that the funds is offered across the whole state and that we are able to balance both like equity and efficiency of program delivery. Making sure that our farmers are bought in and have a say and autonomy over their own management choices, and that our payments are sufficient, right? And so this is what we keep coming back to as the years go on of like, are we doing this? This was what we originally planned. How's it going, right? And this slide was a few seconds ago, but yes, it's really similar to where the PS working group was at that point in their trajectory. Was, you know, we were really inspired by their goals in developing this program. So leaning into quantitative outcomes, we decided that performance modeling was going to be the most effective and efficient way of obtaining an outcome, again, tied into the TMDL reduction goal. We wanted to focus on phosphorus, knowing that that has been a focus of our water quality work at the Agency of Agriculture for many years, and is, you know, we're driven by the TMDL, to be quite frank. So, you know, that was where we landed. And so we used a tool that had already been developed for Vermont by Stone Environmental and calibrated to our local landscape and to our local soils. And we worked with them to develop it into a tool that fit our program even better. But this program, the Farm Phosphorus Reduction Planner, which we call Farm Prep, it models crops growing on the field. And with that modeling, it also models the rain falling on the soil that the crops are growing in, and physically models what's happening on that macroscopic level to the phosphorus that's applied, whether that's taken up into the crop, whether it's released, you know, in runoff, or whether it's bound to the soil, and how that happens over time. So right now we're using a 30-year model window. And all of those calculations are based on some inputs that the user puts in around their soil test and their manure test and their management and their nutrient applications. And then in addition, it pulls some geospatial layers to calculate the soil type and the slope, and among other characteristics. So a really kind of high-powered, interesting model this is based on NRCS's APEX model, for those who are familiar, but it tries to make the user interface a little bit cleaner and easier for folks working with the model. The specific practices that are being modeled in Farm Prep, and as a result, we're able to export and to share with NRCS as being inputted through this program, include nutrient management, crop rotation, cover crops, reduced and no tillage, manure incorporation and manure injection, specifically injection, grazing, buffers, and if people have existing NRCS grassed waterways, we are able to model that through this model as well. This is an example of what it looks like, right? You have these geospatial fields that you draw, and then for each field, you input your management, you input the most recent soil tests, and that allows it to perform those calculations for that field. We saw a slide a little bit earlier about the collaboration between the Agency of Ag and NRCS. I made another thing that, in terms of getting information into the model, we have this like weird three-handed AI handshake that I had fun creating. We've got the Agency of Ag, we've got the conservation districts, and we've got the farm all collaborating to try to make sure that the information that's inputted into Farm Prep, which is like, you know, that's the gold, that's what's making this model happen and providing us with an output of the farm's management, you know, trying to make sure that that's accurate to what the farm did, right? That's all we do throughout the whole year, is try to make sure that Farm Prep has the information in it that matches what the farm did. So the farm in that place is in a seat of power in terms of they can make whatever management decisions that year that they want to. We aren't tying them into any particular practice or acreage or anything. But at the end of the year, we only want to be able to provide payment and see the outputs from what actually happened, right? So that when they make their decisions, we ask them that they keep detailed records, also that they're taking soil and manure tests and updating their nutrient management plan, and that they ultimately share that information with us. We're really, really grateful to our partners at the conservation districts who are doing a lot of that kind of intermediary work of like taking the information from the farms and putting it in farm prep, and then similarly making sure that it's accurate. And then we are kind of that more administrative role on the program of, you know, double checking that everything is justifiable and right, and providing guidance as the need arises. So you may be wondering, okay, that's all very well and good, but how do you decide how much people should get paid? So one of our goals was to ensure that we're providing payments that show a change, right? That show additionality, show that something's happened on the farm that wasn't happening otherwise. But at the same time, we had heard from partners and farmers throughout the working group process that most of our existing programs kind of, you've heard this as well. I don't know if it's totally true, but I'll say it anyway, that folks are incentivized who are doing less well in their current management, right? So like if you have a problem on your farm, you're more likely to get money to fix the problem than if you have for the past 20 years been managing your farm well, right? So that's a perception that's exists in the state among our farming community. And one of our hopes with developing this program was to step away from that. So instead of comparing a farm to themselves or to, you know, their neighbors, we've decided, okay, let's compare all of the farms to the same thing. That'll be the most fair, and it leaves space for folks who maybe if they've been doing this good management for 20 years, we can still capture that as being better than average if it's true that they're, you know, better than average. So to do that, we leaned back into our good old trusty TMDL for the Lake Champlain Basin. And we learned that when the Lake Champlain Basin TMDL was created, essentially they used a model. They made a model of Vermont. They didn't go around asking people what they did on every specific field, right? They had to make some assumptions. And we figured out what those assumptions were, and we are applying them to every farm. So as an example, if you are on like nice, flat, you know, sandy river bottom, floodplain, I won't say floodplain, nice, flat, like good river bottom soil, a lot of farms in Vermont, as you would expect, might be growing corn there. So they made an assumption that, okay, if it's not a too high a slope and it's good soils, maybe that's where people would be growing corn. If it's a higher slope, and maybe it's like really high slope or very erodible, maybe folks are growing hay there. And if it's somewhere in between, maybe it's in rotation, right? So those are not specifically the assumptions they made, but that's the general idea of it, as like what's would be considered potentially possible corn ground, what's not at all possible corn ground, and then what's in between. And so they developed these scenarios where they made a map like you see on the screen that showed them at the time, right? This is corn, this is not hay, and this is corn hay rotation. And then based on that map that they created, they made some assumptions of like, okay, corn, we're going to do this amount of tillage on, depending on the drainage. And we're just going to apply that flat across the whole state. And that's going to be how we develop the current loading for the agricultural sector for the Lake Champlain Basin. And if you have more questions on this, Judson and others at DC, I believe, are much more in depth in this, but this is my general interpretation from talking to Judson and others. So they came up with these scenarios, they applied them, and obviously that's not totally accurate for every individual farm, but it gave them a good enough idea to get a number, which is what they needed to create the TMDL. And so we said, if that's what farms are being compared to, right, that seems somewhat reasonable, that, you're looking at what your field looks like and whether or not it could grow corn. Let's use that for our baseline. So that's what we're comparing every farm's actual management to, is we're comparing it to what they, on average, if they were an average farmer in 2010, could have been doing on that land, considering, their soil type and their slope and some historic land use layers. So that's your baseline. That's what you're being compared to, is this assumption of what historically was assumed in the TMDL likely on your field. And then this current gray here is, well, what are you doing now? And so then your reduction is, what's the difference? That's great. That's pretty straight, not that straightforward, but that makes sense. But we didn't stop there. We thought, okay, that's all very well and good, but we also know that there are some requirements, like you have to be doing better than you were in 2010 already. Also, we have some other payment programs that are helping folks install practices, right? EQIP and FAP are paying for practices. So we already have this baseline assumption that you should be doing somewhat better than back in 2010 assumptions from the TMDL. And we want this program to really pay for folks who go above and beyond and are doing much better than that expectation. So we are taking a 40% threshold. That first 40% of reductions you make won't count towards payments, because we're saying, hey, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do 40%. And that's roughly based on some TMDL expectations across the state. And then beyond that, we said, hey, beyond that, that's all you. That's you being additional. That's you going above and beyond. And that's what we want this program to compensate for. So that's what we're doing. We are paying for $100 per pound of phosphorus once you're in the program, reduced above that threshold. We did, since the program was started, also add an additional payment, which says, okay, if your entire farm across the whole farm is showing less than 0.5 pounds per acre of runoff, let's get you an additional flat rate payment for that. And or if you are above 0.5 pounds but under 1 pound phosphorus loss, that's not quite worth $8, but we'll give you $3 per acre across your whole farm. So again, if you have a big farm, that multiplies out for being under 1 pound P loss. And those are capped at $50,000 per year. And you might be thinking, okay, that's great, but what about the farms who, put a lot of effort in that first year, or maybe they put all their data into the model and they might not even have met that 40% threshold? We have an additional payment that only happens in the first year that is kind of responsive to those concerns, right? Yes, you have put effort in, this first year is hard, and let's pay you up front for the planning work that you as a farm are participating in. And so that is up to $4,000 of a data entry payment. I'll stop in the 2 slides, and then if people have questions, I'd love to talk about that before we dive in further. But I do just want to flag that this entire program is set up on a whole farm basis, right? So we're not looking at one field or your best fields or some subset of fields that aren't in other programs. We're asking farms to submit everything they're doing across their whole farm. And, yes, that does include their heifer paddock that doesn't look very good, right? We want to know what your entire management is across your farm. And the way that kind of ends up playing out is that some of your fields that are doing really, really well and much better than their baselines might end up kind of coming out in the green, being positives towards your overall payment. And then if you have other fields that are, maybe you're doing closer, less than 40% better than your baseline, those fields are coming out more in the red, and those fields are detracting from your overall payment. So we're really asking people to think big picture about how they're managing their land, and you know, they have opportunities if they're hoping to increase their payments as farms to either improve their management of their really good fields and or get more to kind of tipped over into that balance of like, yeah, these fields look good, and or to focus on those fields that are really bringing them down and maybe might be more of a concern if you were visiting them in the field, and to focus on getting them more closer to the average or closer to acceptable in order to pull their overall payment up. So up to the farm on like where to spend their efforts here. And I'll stop there if anyone has any questions on like the setup here. Yeah, Lincoln, go for it.
Yeah, hi, Lincoln Fraskin with the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, and we're also the clean water service provider in the Winooski Basin. And this is the Pay for Phosphorus program is newer to me, so I'm just kind of learning about it here for the first time. So I just want to check my understanding. It sounds like you know, when the farms you're working with exceed the required amount of phosphorus they have to reduce, there's this payment plan for them. And I think that's really cool from a clean water provider perspective, because I think our question is, what is the incentive for these landowners to reduce phosphorus? And it would be great to think about our coordination in terms of if there's farms, say in the Winooski Basin, that are in this program and they're already plugged into, you know, we're going to get paid for these credits, connecting them with the service provider to pay for those you know, those best management practices. So that practice is paid for, and then they're also getting something on top from you all. Is that a possibility?
I think what you're describing in terms of an overall framework works with most programs. I'm hesitant to speak specifically to clean water service provider because I know there's some like figuring out what's like an ag practice versus what's not an ag practice that's like specific to that space. And to be honest, for this program, right, ag practices tend to be, you know, what we're putting through the model is really like ag focused management changes, whether that's cover cropping or tillage or so on and so forth. But generally speaking, your understanding's correct, and that is like was our hope behind this program, is to be able to leverage whoever is focusing on helping the farm get there, and then to be kind of the carrot on the end of the stick for once you're there.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Gianna.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Sonia. This is really cool to hear about. And I'm curious, I've not played with the farm prep and curious about some of its functionality. So if a farmer was, you know, seeing something like this and seeing some of their fields being problematic, are there sort of scenario tools where they can run through different practices on that field, figure out what the cost of that practice is, and does the cost outweigh the credit they could get? Like, is there some way to sort of balance what the cost of each practice might be for that field to then kind of get a net positive in the end for some decision making?
That's a great question, and I've heard this from a couple of folks. So the farm prep tool does not currently allow for like cost calculations. That would have to be added if we wanted to provide that. What farm prep does have is it does have a scenario tool like you're describing, but it's separate from cost. It's more like, you know, if I installed no-till instead of doing this tillage, how would that change my overall output? So yes and no. I think we'd all be really interested in seeing what a cost element could look like, but it's not in there right yet. And I'll get onto this a little bit later, but so far as of right now in the program, we were really hoping that farmers would really take advantage of that kind of like planning or like digging into the scenarios. And so far that hasn't happened that much from our conversations with farms, which in retrospect probably shouldn't be too surprising, but that is a goal for us for upcoming years is to work even harder with our conservation district folks who are already managing a lot in terms of just like making sure everything's in there and accurate. But like once they feel good about that, to like go to the next step with like opening it up with the farm, running through some scenarios, and really using it as a talking point, both for conservation planning or for like reiterating messages you might have already shared with the farm of like, oh, you should really seed down that field, and then say, okay, well, if you seeded down that field, let's see what it would do in terms of your potential payments. So that's definitely a hope dream that we're working towards, and I'll talk a little bit about some steps we're trying to take to make it more accessible to farms. So we get there. Thanks, Gianna. I'm going to keep going, and we can have some more questions as they come up. But just a snapshot of where we are. We have had about we just accepted 17 new farms to do data entry this year. If that's successful, we'll have had 80 farms successfully put their initial plan into farm prep for their data entry payments. And then of those farms, so far we've worked with 54, I believe, who have made it past that 40% threshold and been accepted into the like performance payment space, which is a high number, right? So that shows that a really significant number of our farms are doing much better than the TMDL assumed that they were in 2010. So that's promising news. And so, by the end of this year, if assuming most of the 2024 ones again are able to be in that category, that means we'll have worked with 70 farms total, which is, I think, really exciting and a testament to a lot of people working really hard over the last couple of years in like districts and as farmers. So thank you to all of you and them. And again, we're right now, as of like where we're positioned right now, we're really hoping to get payments out to the 2023 and 2022 cohorts for their work this past year. And we're really right in the middle of that right now, trying to quantify how folks did and make sure that information is accurate. Zooming in now to the 2022 cohort and the data that we had from their implementation in calendar year 2023, which is really the only data we have concretely available right now. The average payment per farm was $15,000, again with the cap being 50. And Judson made this, which was nice, or either he or Brody dug into kind of what that looks like on different size farms. And so not surprisingly, the bigger farms did tend to receive a larger payment because we are looking whole farm, and there's more opportunities for conservation on those farms. And across the board, the SFOs and CSFOs who were able to apply, per acre were at a higher rate of payment. So maybe, I don't want to draw too many conclusions from that because it's not a huge sample size, but I do think the folks who were able to come to us who are smaller seem to be being like really intentional across their whole land base, whereas like these LFOs on average were managing 1,500 acres and doing so reasonably well, enough to receive payment and pretty big payments, but per acre that is less, even though overall they were receiving more money. So just an interesting fact about how those breakdowns went. These numbers might be slightly out of date, but they're generally right. And then to dive in, I'm going to give you all like the deep dive into what we found from 2022. Again, caveats, this is a model and we're based on the information that we had in our model. And this is what Judson put together. So thank you, Judson. None of this would look anything like this or exist if it was just me trying to run through them. So in the calendar year 22, we had 45 farms participate. That added up to over 2,000 fields and close to 30,000 acres modeled through the software. Of that, most of the land was either in hay or a corn hay rotation, slightly less corn, but still significant. And then we did have some farmers who were managing either a corn soy rotation or specifically grain crops or specifically vegetable crops. Judson was excited to learn that most of the soils that were in the program were D soils, and really a range of soil test Ps, which seems to be maybe what I'd expect with, you know, centered around the middle optimum. Mostly non-clay with 30% clay soils. And of those clay soils, those were the most dominant individual soil types. Across the board, most of the fields were pretty low in phosphorus loss. And some of the fields had a really lot of phosphorus loss. So both of those things were true, right? The average was really quite low, and then there were individual instances on basically every land use type where the phosphorus loss was much higher per acre. And yeah, you can see that again in this graph here, that really the vast majority of fields that were modeled were, you know, under about 2 pounds P per acre, but then the tail end really trails out there with some fields that seem based on the model to be releasing a lot of phosphorus. So yeah, 61% of the total phosphorus loss happened on a quarter of the fields, so this top quarter of the fields. And then close to 10% was happening on less than 2% of the acres. So really highlighted for us the idea of, like, you know, those fields that are really exhibiting that high phosphorus loss, like if we were able to target those for conservation, could have a really significant impact overall on the losses across the state. This is a graph that is showing that this is a model, right? So we were trying to understand what factors about a farm's land or about a farm's management might lead to them having a higher phosphorus loss on that field, right? So here Judson has graphed increase. So he's split all of the fields we saw into different categories based on the pounds per acre P loss, right? So on the left, we have the fields that are really low P loss. On the right, we have fields that are much higher P loss. And then on average for fields in those bins, he said, well, what's the average amount of phosphorus applied? What's the average slope? What's the average soil test P? And so, as you might expect, but we were interested to see that basically on those fields that have higher losses from them, we are also seeing that there's higher phosphorus applied on those fields. We see that those fields might have a higher slope, and we see that those fields on average might have a higher soil test P. So, you know, not conclusive, nothing more than it seems as though things like having increasing soil P, increasing slope, and increasing phosphorus applied might be some reasons why those fields were experiencing higher runoff. Not an experiment, but interesting. Similarly, in those same bands of those higher P loss, lower P loss fields, going from lower P loss on the left to higher P loss on the right, Judson was interested in seeing, well, how are those fields managed? And, you know, again, across the board, it seemed as though more of the fields in the lower P loss band on the left were managed as hay, whereas more of the fields in that, like, who were really losing a lot of phosphorus were managed as corn. And then corn hay rotations made up a sizable chunk of each of those bands. And so, you know, digging in a little bit more to that, right? So this first graph is looking at, okay, in that band, what's the ratio of different types of management to each other? This next graph is like, okay, let's dig into that. What's the average phosphorus loss on these different land use types? And I just want to remind people before we dig too deep here that, like, really corn hay, and hay are what we had good sizable chunks of fields for. Corn, soy, grain, and vegetable were much fewer. So I would guess that those you know how it goes with small data sets, is you can't necessarily draw the same conclusions. But that said, it was interesting to look at them all. And across the board, as you could potentially might expect, corn fields tended to have a higher rate of phosphorus loss than hay. Vegetable also reasonably high, as again, those are spaces where tillage might be more practiced. Diving into why that might be the case, right? We see corn, we see that erosion is kind of follows that same trend. So maybe erosion is one of the factors here. And the soil test phosphorus, again, tended to be higher on the corn ground than on our hay ground or our corn hay as inputs to the model. As another input to the model that the farmer has a lot more control over, the phosphorus applied, again, as you might expect, people are applying more phosphorus to their corn or to their corn hay rotations than they might need to their perennial crops. And then trying to think about what percentage of that phosphorus applied is actually running off. Judson made this nice graph where you can see what you see, right? Corn again is a little higher, hay and corn hay are a little lower. But I think this is also a good reminder that across the board, right, in this model, only 4% of the overall phosphorus applied is running off across these fields. So we are still looking at, a relatively small proportion of the phosphorus following that pathway to runoff, as opposed to being taken up in the crop, regardless of what crop we're looking at. So thinking a little bit more about that, we were kind of thinking, okay, well, what pathway is bringing us there? So, across the board, sediment erosion in the model seems to be the major pathway. Soluble being the other more sizable, about a quarter to about 15%, depending on which types of fields you're looking at. And that's true mostly across them. And then the tile really just has to do with which of these fields are tiled, because you only have tile erosion if you have tile. But that's, sediment was by far the more dominant pathway. Again, this is just a reminder of, right? So like when we're looking at these fields, you can have the good fields that are getting paid, you can have fields that are below the thresholds who are not getting paid. So we want, again, to dig in, okay, well, what are people getting paid for? So on the whole, every type of land or of crop, some fields are getting paid for, some fields are not. I think interesting trends are that in corn ground, on average, more fields are essentially detracting from a farm's overall payment than are adding to it. The reverse is true of hay. If you manage hay fields well, more of those fields are going to be adding to your payment than detracting from it. And so, so like really honing in on that here in this slide, that corn hay rotations actually tend to be adding to your payment if you're implementing rotations. And then thinking about what percentage of your fields of this land use type are getting paid, right? Like that's a quarter for corn, a much higher percentage for grain or hay, and then in between for corn hay. So these were our attempts to dig into like crop type, because that in farm prep is a really clean output that is associated with a field. We of course are really interested as well in practices and how the practices are doing. And I'm going to share this slide and with the caveat that figuring out to what degree an individual practice contributed to a farm's payment in farm prep is almost impossible, because they layer so much, right? You're not saying like this field has cover crop. You're saying this field has a cover crop that was planted early and was paired with incorporated addition of this much manure, and in the spring then we did no-till, right? So all of that, all of those factors are contributing to the output for them from that particular field. So being able to tease out, well, how did cover crop do across all of these farms? Basically, then you have to ask the question of like, well, were they doing any other practices? How did that, what else happened? And so the data is much harder. So what I'm showing here is we ran basically the same fields in farm prep, just test fields, and we added additional practices to them and ran the output to see how the phosphorus loss would change. So kind of like a model experiment in some ways. And, good news, practices tend to help, right? All of the practices seem to have a better output than no practices did. And that also the more you layer, the better your management would be. So makes sense, but a good test for the tool that stacking practices is very effective in the tool. Any questions before I dive too deep on kind of these results? I know we're almost out of time, so I'll let this be the conversation if folks want to jump in. I'll add, if there aren't any, I'll keep going, but so just generally, I think we talked through many of these, but like folks are doing better. Some fields are contributing really a high percentage of the loss. I think reducing nutrient applications is an opportunity that a lot of other programs aren't capturing, that this program is really capturing very well and really focused on in some ways. With the like more management type things being that, we've gotten a lot more interest in nutrient management plan updates, and also, this takes a lot of work and a lot of data and a lot of time. So things to mull on as we look to the future, and we are considering some outcomes. I was telling Gianna before about, we're trying to think about how we can use this as a planning tool, and we're working on creating some visualization tools that'll make it more, these same results, like the graphs I just showed you, we hope to be able to share with an individual farm based on this is your farm, and here's a pie chart, here's a bar chart. So those are our hopes going forward. If anyone wants to chat more outside of this, I'm always happy to think about kind of PS and the bigger picture questions. I see Keith.
Yeah, thanks very much for this presentation. I know this is more of like a field practices kind of focus, but I just was wondering, I'm a watershed planner, so I was wondering if it seemed like there's any appetite among farmers to like adopt larger buffers through this pay for P program yet?
That's a great question. So we can model larger buffers, and they have a pretty significant effect. So I think what we're hoping is that as we get more into this conservation planning stage and lean into that a little more, that could be an opportunity that farmers will recognize.
Cool, thank you. I actually had one follow-up. Just recognizing that there are, certain fields that are contributing most P and maybe have the highest, most efficient in terms of targeting them for reductions. Does that kind of flavor how you're considering more outreach on this program moving forward? Or is it really just farmers coming to you if they're interested?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I guess how are farmers sort of hearing about and enrolling in the program? Is it they're really coming to you, or are you targeting specific farms in your initial outreach?
Yeah, so it's some of both is happening. So some folks are coming to us. By far the most successful, I would say, like pathway into this program is that Franklin County Natural Resource District in particular has identified that this is a really great program for incentivizing nutrient management plan updates. And so they are specifically working with farms on their nutrient management plan and referring them into this program as a good fit if they're able to keep their good records and install the practices that the district's advising them on, et cetera. So I would say in Franklin, there's been a really lovely kind of collaborative relationship pipeline. And that's happening to a lesser degree in other parts of the state. And so in some parts of the state, it's really just farms hearing about us and joining on their own.
All right, thank you very much again for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sharing anymore, am I?
We're still seeing your next step slide. All right.
Okay, well, I don't know how to stop that, but sounds good.
Thank you so much, Sonia. We really appreciate this in-depth look at the program.
Yeah, thank you all. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Always happy to chat. I think this kind of work is super fascinating. So.
Great. Thank you so much. If folks have any questions, feel free to reach out directly to Sonia. If you also want to respond in the survey that I put into the chat, we can get those questions over to that team. So with that, we'll say thanks and have a great afternoon, everyone.